Hey, and welcome back to the Relationship Schools podcast here. I'm Jason, your host. What's up? Hey, if you haven't noticed, we are now called the Relationship School podcast. That was I think, an important transition because not everybody is a couple that listens to this, and we want to be even more inclusive in terms of talking about family relationships, friendships, work relationships, etc. Okay, so the Relationship School podcast. And that's the brand. That's what we're doing, is we're giving you an education in relationships, okay? That's what's going on. If you want to join our free group, go to relationshipschool.com/community, okay? Thousands of people in there getting after it, and I go live in there about once a week and trying to answer your questions. So if you want a personal question asked or answered, please join that group and ask me, all right? And ideally do it on a live, because I'll grill you on a live call. Here's a review from Justin. I get something out of every single podcast. I'm going through divorce. Jason and guests always leave me with something to question or challenge myself and my relationships. This podcast is a key part of my growth towards being a relationship warrior. Dude, thank you. Thanks for the 5-star review. If you want to leave us a review, please do. Scroll down with your thumbs on your iPhone. If you have an iPhone, Apple Podcasts, just click 4 stars. That's easy. Or you can actually do what Justin did here and leave us a comment. Always appreciated. Thanks, guys. Working our way up to the millions of great reviews, right? Okay, millions is probably a fantasy, but you know what I mean. A lot. This podcast is about growing through the vehicle of relationship. Doesn't matter what relationship you're in. If it's painful, there's an opportunity for you to learn about yourself. And that is what I'm about. And that's what I try to help you wake up to, okay? It sucks to be in the victim seat in a relationship when you've been hurt. The way out of that is to take personal responsibility, become a student, and learn, all right? And I want to encourage you to keep learning here because, you know, when you're stuck in that place, it's pretty hard to help you, for other people to help you, because you're identified with all of your stories of how bad and wrong you are or bad and wrong other people are. That's limited. So this podcast is about trying to help you come out of that place and get empowered, or if you are already empowered and getting more empowered, then how to help other people who are kind of stuck. Okay, we ultimately want to help the world love better. Yeah. In this episode, I've got an amazing neuroscientist by the name of Judy Cameron. I met Judy at the NARME conference, where I spoke with her, not together, but separately. And her speech was so cool because she just broke down some stuff about neuroscience I just haven't heard. And we get into it today. She is the professor of psychiatry, neuroscience, obstetrics, clinical and translational science, and behavioral and community sciences there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's just cool to hear. I'm just going to let her explain how sort of she got into that, and it just sounds like she's asked to speak all over the world on the subject of children and their brain development, and how we can help children become more awesome, resilient, great kids by learning about how the brain works. So it's just awesome. Okay, and she's just done a ton of research if you just kind of Google her for a little bit. Okay. Let me tell you. So just a couple highlights here. We cover a lot of stuff. The 3 things to build strong brain pathways. All right. I want you to listen in on that. How kids learn, why it's important to teach your kid stuff before 5. So if you don't have kids, don't worry. I want you to think about yourself as a kid and what you learned and what you didn't learn, how your parents were, what kind of environment you grew up in. She has a really cool reframe on the resiliency of the human brain and its intelligence and what it pursues in terms of the learning. And the strategies it employs. It's fascinating. We talk about the brain really being plastic until age 25, and then what happens after age 25 for those of us that are older than 25. Are we screwed? Well, listen to this podcast and find out. So I think you're going to dig this one. Let's jump right in. All right, here's Dr. Judy Cameron. All right, welcome to the show, Dr. Judy Cameron.
I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. It's good to see you again. Judy, you and I met in Nashville at the NARME conference, which is the National Association for Marriage Relationship Education. So I saw your presentation there on really neuroscience in the brain, and particularly with kids and what us adults can do to help children. It was fascinating. So I'm just grateful to get a little time with you.
Well, I think it's very exciting that your audience is interested in this topic. I spend a lot of time going all over talking about how adults can help children have really sturdy brain development.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we're going to get into that. Before we do, just give the listeners a sense of like who you are right now in your life and what are you up to?
Well, I am a neuroscientist and I study brain development. But about 20 years ago, we were able to show that experiences play a large role in shaping brain development. And I think before that, people had thought genetics played the much larger role. You have a baby whose brain is born and they're going to acquire all sorts of skills, maybe in those preschool years, and then go on and their brain will continue to be shaped by schools. And we really thought that the brain unfolds due to genetic programming and you're kind of just pouring in information. And that turns out to be wrong. It turns out that the experiences you have from the time you're born onward, while the brain is developing, are actually constructing the brain pathways that you're going to have the rest of your life. So there's a much bigger role for experiences. And I thought that was really exciting information. I was invited a number of places to talk about it. And people were more excited than I expected. They said, oh my gosh, if experiences matter that much, you should really get this message out to everybody. We need to make sure that children have experiences where they can build really strong brain pathways for their future. And a number of groups asked if I could start giving talks to broader audiences. And for the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, I ended up going and talking to state legislators. I've now been to almost every single state legislature in the country and have talked to finance ministers and prime ministers in many foreign countries about this issue. And I think that really opened the horizon that more people than just people who specialize in brain development and neuroscience could really use this information. So by the time you saw me, we have gone even further than that. We've started to develop educational materials to teach anybody about brain development so we can really disseminate this information.
Yeah, that's so cool. We're going to talk about why this is so important in child development here shortly. But before we do, and by the way, just tangent was, as you were talking, I was thinking of also how powerful it is now in the research around skill development, learning sports or dance or music, in terms of what we can actually do through repetition and through experience. So maybe we could touch on that. But before we do that, backing up a little bit now, you're a psychiatrist also, is that right?
No, I'm a neuroscientist, but my entire career I've been housed in the Department of Psychiatry.
Okay.
And so the chairman of psychiatry hired me because he thought it would be really interesting to have a basic scientist who thinks about these issues to interact with all the clinicians. Psychiatry in Pittsburgh is a huge department. And most of the people are either psychiatrists or psychologists, but he really felt that having a neuroscientist who understood brain development would expand the horizons. And for me, it's been fantastic because I work on projects that have direct application to what people are really facing and the problems we're trying to solve.
Yeah, so cool. Now, how did you get into neuroscience in the first place? Like, how old were you? What happened? What was going on in your life that had you pursue this?
This will surprise you. So my father was a physicist and my mother a mathematician, and I went to college and in physics. And in my senior year, I was at the University of California at Berkeley. The school said, you have to take a breadth requirement to graduate. And I said, well, what is a breadth requirement? And they said, anything but what you've been taking, which was basically physics, math, and chemistry. And I took a physiology class to learn about the brain. And the instructor was just incredibly fascinating. And I just became completely intrigued with how can the brain process all the information it gets and then turn around and direct the body to do the right thing. Yeah. And physicists think about circuits and communication a lot. And so I was coming at it from that perspective. And it really changed my life. I decided I would work in a lab in physiology, and I did that my senior year. I applied to graduate school to continue doing that. Wow. My parents were upset I wasn't going into physics, but I was really excited. And I have worked my way through neuroscience, but I've always come at it from a very different background from everybody else. I'm really interested in integration. How do life experiences going on in the real world really change our brain? And as you can see, that's what I'm still working on. I use this as a story in undergraduate courses I teach to tell people, take some courses that you're just interested in that aren't required, because you never know what you're going to find yourself really liking. And what matters most in your life is that you find something you love to do. Yeah. Your whole life will be improved that way. And I think for me, that requirement that I take a breath requirement was awesome.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that they call that a breath requirement. It's like take a breath from this focused study or something. That's so cool. Okay, and I just want to kind of set the tone as we dive in here. Just kind of one possible tone or frame, which is just kind of where we're at as a society with raising kids. I just want to throw out a few statistics and kind of get your take on these. So, different statistics I read say different things, but in general, one of the consistent ones is about 10 million kids are on medication under the age of 17. That's 1 in 4 kids. 25 million adults take antidepressants, and around 50% of the U.S. takes at least one prescription medication. On top of that, if we just look at the state of people's health, you could say we're a pretty unhealthy culture, even though we have this externally obsession with how we look or whatever. But on the inside, like autoimmune disorders are on the rise, certainly mental health disorders. We're a complex species, and it seems to be we're not necessarily getting any better, and we have lots of challenges. Just on the big picture, what's your sort of, when you see the numbers and you see stuff like this, what do you think and what do you do?
I think that I hear what you're saying, and I actually agree that these are things that we should be worrying about. But I think I probably worry a lot more than you do. And part of the reason is I have a broader global perspective. About 2 years ago, or maybe it was 3 now, I was giving a talk at the UNICEF World Congress, and I was really excited because this was the first year that UNICEF actually cared about children's brain development. Always before, they've cared about, do children have adequate housing and do they have adequate food and medical attention? And that's been really the entire focus of what our world organization taking care of children has cared about. And for years, different players have been trying to tell them, you should be worried about their brain development. If we're going to go on and be able to continue as a species, we want people that solve problems. We want people that will have really sturdy brain development. Well, at this meeting, I spoke very early in the meeting to introduce this topic as part of a panel that introduced this topic about brain development to the World Congress. They led off the Congress by saying a third of the world's children are living in active war zones. And I almost just dropped over. I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I knew, having lived in the United States and been familiar with a lot of Western countries, there were all sorts of issues, some of which you brought up, that we need to attend to so that children can grow up healthier and more functional. But a third of the world's children live in active war zones.
Wow.
I mean, I sat there with my stomach in knots thinking, how are we going to survive as a species? This is a really tough thing.
Yeah.
So I do worry, and I worry even more because we are not paying attention, I think we need to do, to giving children really healthy experiences to allow them to build the best brains possible. We're going to be totally dependent on those children growing up and being able to solve the world's problems. We need to give them the tools. And from my perspective, that means give them the brain pathways that are going to allow them to solve the problems. So we're on the same page. I think I probably worry more.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, and would you also say it's, because as we get into the sort of structures and pathways in the brain and how we can help children be more resilient and how we can, as adults, even, rewire our brains because the brain is plastic, are we, when you look at the stats, let's say in the US, and even if we look at those global ones of 1 in 3 kids living in a war zone, to me, my trauma, lens comes into play and says, okay, these kids are clearly under stress. Call it trauma, call it stress. And that's the factor that's inhibiting their brain development. Would you say that's true?
No, I think your brain is actually designed to work really well in whatever circumstance you're in. So different pathways will develop depending on what's the situation you're in and what your brain is having to do. So let's think of a situation where we have a child that is living in a situation where their parents are fairly impoverished and they often are hungry and they don't have enough food.
Yeah.
What will they be doing? They will spend their time thinking about, how am I going to get food and how am I going to make sure I get my fair share? Where is the food? Where do I go? Who is likely to feed me?
Yep.
How do I have access to it? Are they building brain pathways? Absolutely, yes. The brain is doing just exactly what you want it to do. It has a problem to solve. It's figuring out the solution. It is directing the body to undertake that solution, and it strengthens. The more you use a brain pathway, the more it will be strengthened. So if the child has this situation over the first few years of life, they'll become really good at fending for themselves. And that's a great thing because they probably wouldn't survive if they didn't do it. So I think the brain is really phenomenal. It's customized to strengthen the brain pathways that you need. And it does a great job of doing that. Now, is that child spending a lot of time reading books? Maybe not, because they're very focused on this other issue. So they won't develop the same brain pathways for reading. And that's going to put them at a disadvantage if they end up being in a society where people go to school and they have to read to do well in school and to get a job. That's something that they aren't going to have as strong a brain pathways for. But the issue here is that every single child is different. So I said, what if they don't read so much? And you nodded your head and said, oh, yeah, that might lead to not reading. But think of a third child now. This is a child that is also hungry, spends a lot of time thinking about how to get enough food, but they escape reality by reading. What'll happen in their brain?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're going to strengthen brain pathways for making sure they know how to take care of themselves, where the resources are. But they will also be strengthening brain pathways for reading. And so they're not going to be at the same disadvantage, but they may not do other things. So children are complex. They learn a whole bunch of different things at the same time. And the message that we try to get people to understand is that what the child is actually doing and what they're thinking about is shaping their brain and strengthening brain pathways. So an adult from the outside might look in and say, oh, well, this child's reading, they're going to be okay, they'll do okay in school. But if they're not learning anything else, they're not learning their alphabet, they're not learning early math skills, I mean, maybe they won't do okay in school. They'll be okay with reading, not okay with the other. And so we have to think of the child kind of as a whole package, and we want to get them to have strong pathways for everything they're going to have to do later on.
Yeah, for sure. I love this kind of view because it's a strength-based view of seeing the kid is already, like the brain is already, just doing its job. And it may not be in a context that someone would prefer, but given the situation they're growing up in, it's doing its job and it's doing well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
exactly.
Cool. So if we take that view then, and we look at, because this is a relationship podcast, and we bring in the context of relationship, and kids who, have a hard time sitting still in class and actually are maybe a little bit mean and more on the bully side of things, or they have a hard time fitting in and they can't connect, and they feel kind of alone. And then with social media, as they grow, they start to compare themselves to everybody, and they keep trying on different personalities essentially to belong. When we start to take that sort of view, and then they feel bad about themselves because they're not that, they're themselves, but they're trying to fit into what their parents or society expects of them. When we look at that child's brain and the stress going on, I'm going to guess you're going to say that, their brain is now focused on different things, which is a good thing, but what about the cost? Can you speak a little bit about that context?
I'm going to change your question just a little bit, because what I would seeing a child who is really antsy and just can't pay attention, and then, has kind of aspects that might be related to ADHD, and then they have some trouble socially connecting as they get older and they're under a lot of stress. I think we can understand how to help them better if we look at what came before, not what comes after. I think you first have to look at what comes before. So how did they end up being a child in school in first grade or third grade or whatever you were imagining, where they're antsy and they can't pay attention and they can't sit still? What led them to get to that place? And why did it happen? So I'll give you an example that I often use in talks of how the brain develops a brain pathway that's really, really useful when you're young, but then is not so useful as you get older because you have a hard time socially interacting with other people. Okay. So the example I often use is a child growing up in a household where there's an adult who has trouble controlling their anger. And that child will become an expert. There's a part of your brain that recognizes emotions, and it's developing pathways in the first 5 years of life. This child will become an expert on recognizing anger. And anger is a really complicated emotion. Sometimes anger can be red in the face and loud and mad. Sometimes anger can be withdrawn and cold. Those are both anger. And this child who experiences a lot of anger they will become super good at detecting anger.
Yep.
Like I say, the brain is always trying to protect you and strengthen brain pathways you need. And almost all children will get out of the way when they see anger. So this child recognizes anger and goes outside or goes to their room or goes and plays downstairs.
Or tries to calm the parent by being funny or whatever they do.
Right. And if they can't get out of the way, they try to distract the parent. Mm-hmm. Or worst situation, they just do something and try to ignore what's going on. They're mentally getting out of the way. We all can look at this and say, this is great. This is just what the brain should be doing at that age. They're a little child under 5. They're not going to be able to protect themselves against an angry adult. So they've come up with a strategy for identifying anger and getting out of a way, finding a resolution that will protect them. Yeah. And they may not get to be 5 years old if they didn't come up with that. So the brain is doing an awesome job. However, let's think of that same child now. We'll put them in 3rd grade because I'm imagining you were thinking about a 3rd grader when you asked your question.
Sure, 3rd, 5th grade,
3rd, 4th, 5th grade. We've got that child kind of in the middle of school, and they've forgot their homework or not done it, not turned it in several times now, and the teacher gets really mad. What is this child going to do? This child is going to be super good at understanding the teacher's mad. And they've developed strong brain pathways for leaving, for running away. So we all can look at that and say the right thing to do is not for the child to leave the classroom. It is not for the child to ignore the teacher. Mm-hmm. What we're wanting that child to do is to recognize that the teacher's mad at them because they care about them. But that's not what they have strong brain pathways.
That doesn't get communicated,
for. And so I think we, as the adults in the situation, need to try to think back to how did this child get this way? Because the teacher may just get mad if they're mad at the child for not turning in their homework and the child just ignores them. And I feel like educating all the adults and saying, wait a minute, step back. Why is the child ignoring this? Maybe they developed strong brain pathways to ignore this. And they, just kick into what they have strong brain pathways for. If you want them to change their behavior now, you need to do a better job of how you get mad. You can say, I'm mad, but I'm mad because I really care about you. Mm-hmm. And I want you to do your homework because it's really going to help you. We're all help you with it, all work with you. But if I do that, then you have to try to turn your homework in. That strategy is the adult not just thinking, okay, I'm going to start where the child's at and take them forward. They're trying to think about what was the antecedent cause. How did this child get to be this way? The same would be true for the example you gave me. I mean, you have a child that's very antsy, very fidgety. I mean, how did they get to be that way? And why are they reacting to the environment they're in? Are they bored? Is that the issue? I mean, what led them to have this strategy? So I think that the way we've all been socialized, certainly I was that, from the time you're very young, you're kind of an autonomous individual and you're behaving the way that reflects your personality. But when you look at it from a neuroscience perspective, you realize that children are building brain pathways, and however they're behaving at any one moment is a reflection of which pathways have been strengthened and which haven't. So when you see a behavior that you think they'd be better off changing, you want to think about where did that come from? Because it didn't just spontaneously erupt.
No, of course
in
not.
them.
There's a root.
It came from something. And if you want to move them in a direction that you think will help them do better in school or help them do better making friends or adjusting socially later on, then you have to understand where it came from and then work with them to strengthen new pathways. Now, the good news is you're developing brain pathways till you're about 25. And so adults who care about children have brain pathways they can work with. But each pathway has a plastic period. That's what a neuroscientist would call it. They would say, well, the plastic period for motor function is your first 5 years of life. And you mentioned that sports and getting kids to do really well at sports is something you wanted to have a conversation about. I mean, I love that. So I am always pointing out that people like tennis pros really listen to neuroscientists. They hear neuroscientists say you're building pathways for movement in the first 5 years of life. So they want their child to be able to be good at tennis.
Sure.
So they'll put a tennis racket in a 2-year-old's hand and they'll start batting balls back and forth, because if they use those muscles all the time, they're going to strengthen the pathways in the brain, and they will always be capable of making those movements rest of their life. Does it mean they'll be a tennis star? No. You have to have the opportunity to play, you have to want to practice, and so on and so forth. But if you do decide to be a tennis star, you are going to be in much better shape than somebody who didn't strengthen those pathways early.
Yeah.
So, later on, when a child is in middle school or high school or early 20s, the brain pathways that are being strengthened are not the same brain pathways that were being strengthened early for emotion recognition or for movement skills. They're pathways from the front part of your brain that regulate all the rest of your brain. They're kind of more complex regulation pathways. So adults that understand this can work with children to get them to have better regulation.
Yeah, cool. I'm hearing, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel's work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Dr. Siegel talks about attachment, obviously, is one of his big frames. And what you're saying, in a way, is similar, where it's through the relationship that actually the brain changes. It's not just this, solitary thing that the brain is growing. In fact, brains would probably wither in just complete isolation. The brain develops in relationship with other people. So with the anger example, so let's say that kid had the stressful, traumatic childhood, whatever you want to call it, got really good at reading faces and anger. And I remember you mentioning this at the NARME talk. I think you said something like kids who grow up in homes with anger, their anger recognition is really good, and they are 30% more likely to see anger on people's faces. So if we take that kind of superpower that this kid has, but they're having a hard time sitting still, or they're acting out in school, socially that's not necessarily good for them. But it's through the teacher or the parents can help change that, is what I'm hearing, through, like, I would call it secure attachment principles around seeing the kid, helping the kid feel safe, helping the kid feel not judged. And that requires quite a bit of awareness on an adult's part. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree. I'm right there with you. I think caring adults play an enormous role in shaping child brain development.
Hey, are you struggling with conflict right now? Are you a little in a pinch? Do you want to feel more accepted and connected, maybe less judged or criticized? Then come play with us here virtually for our first ever virtual workshop here at the Relationship School. You can be anywhere in the world, sitting on your ass at your home, learning about conflict and learning how to work through it. Go to relationshipschool.com/connected. So here's Dave and Jane, who came to our last Accepted and Connected event, and what they had to say about it.
We initially signed up for this workshop to improve our relationship and ease some of the conflict that was going on in our lives and in our relationship. We were in a crisis, not the first, and we really wanted to find a way to resolve conflict with each other and to bring the love and connection back into our relationship.
I wanted to resolve the conflict before we got here, and I think we probably did do that, so it's been a really enjoyable experience for me.
Likewise, the experience that we actually ended up having was a very joyful, very nourishing experience.
And it was really quite simple. It wasn't complicated, and there wasn't a lot of heady theory and abstract. It's just very real, very practical.
I would absolutely recommend this course for others. I think that it's a gift that you can give to yourself and to others who are very special to you, to your loved ones, on how you can focus more on love and connection to build relationships, strengthen the ones you have, and to resolve conflict.
It's a really fun weekend. It's high energy. It's nothing painful. It's challenging for people, but I think it's also very positive. Everyone in the room was very happy in general. They've got their struggles, but you didn't feel that drag of energy at all. And Jason's just next level.
What I witnessed even in such a short time with so many people, such a large group, is that people felt comfortable enough in that space to share just kind of their deepest feelings of what was going on for them. And that's very powerful.
All right, there you have it. Another happy couple who got on the other side of some challenges and learned some new tools. None of us want to be stuck in conflict, guys, for a long time. So you got to learn how to work through it, though. And I'm offering you an awesome deal, a 2-day event from anywhere in the world you can just attend on your computer. Okay, relationshipschool.com/connected to sign up. The early bird deal goes up soon, so get in there now. All right, back to the podcast. So in terms of the neuroscience stuff you do, how much of it does or does not involve attachment, kind of this attachment science? I'm just curious.
I think it's broader than that. So I think attachment is important, but we don't focus in particular on that. What we're really interested in is, and I will talk about it in terms of the cycle of learning, that to learn anything and to strengthen any brain pathway, you have to become interested in doing some sort of skill.
Yeah.
So you can't become good at something unless you're interested in becoming good at it. And I often talk to adults and they go, well, of course, yeah. And I'm there, well, you say, of course, but that's actually the hardest part. How do you get a kid to be interested in what you think they would do much better with learning? It's really tricky to tailor the learning opportunity right to that kid so they become interested in it. Then they have to use their own brain circuits to do the activity. They can't just listen to the adult talk about it. They actually have to do
Experience it.
If it requires thinking, let's say recognizing that the teacher's unhappy with them for their performance, they have to recognize it. They have to see the teacher's voice, hear the words, and recognize it. You can tell them, but until they do it and they use their own brain circuits, they're not going to strengthen them. So it starts with interest. It then goes to engagement. But then I think the third part of the cycle of learning is building self-confidence. And self-confidence does two things. It allows you to try to do that skill over and over again. And to build strong brain pathways, you have to use them thousands of times. So you have to have enough self-confidence, even if you're really bad at something, to try it again and again and again.
I think you said 10,000 times at the talk. I think you said 10,000 times.
Yeah. On average. I mean, we use that kind of as a broad number. I'll tell stories sometimes. I have 3 kids who've just made it through their teenage years. And so I'll say, I remember when they were in high school saying, I told you 10 times not to do that. Aren't you listening to me?
Yeah.
And then I kind of self-reflect and I think, right, And I'm going to have to tell them 9,990 more times not to do it.
Yeah.
Because it takes an enormous amount. And
Repetition,
trying
yeah.
to get adults to understand that to build strong brain pathways, kids have to be interested in doing something, try it themselves, develop enough self-confidence that they'll do it over and over and over again until they have that skill.
And I've noticed that
and
it's...
that we,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we as adults have to remember this too, because we think, okay, you as they're getting older, they look grown up, they kind of act grown up much of the time, and you think, you're 15, you seem pretty grown up. Why aren't you getting better at this? But they have 10 more years of building brain pathways. So they're not going to be good at the things those pathways do. And those pathways developing from about 11 or 12 to 25 are involved in decision making, problem solving, inhibitory control, complex reasoning. So if you're expecting a child to be good at those things, they're not going to get there until much later.
Yeah, that's a helpful reminder. I love this frame of the interest, that the three things you mentioned, which I wrote those down, interest, engagement, and then building self-confidence. I see that with my own kids. My kids are now 11 and 9, and it's really fascinating to watch. When my son is motivated, meaning interested, he's like a learning machine. He's so engaged, and then he continues to feel his confidence. It's so fun to watch him. And then if I want him to do something that he doesn't want to do, it's really also interesting to see he's not interested, he doesn't care, then he's doing it for me. So I think this is a good reminder for parents around kids' values. Like if we naturally support children's interests and their values, even if they're different from our own, learning is so much easier and they can really shine and we can celebrate them. And yeah, sure, it's important to teach kids how to, do things they don't want to do. But like it doesn't need to be that hard, I don't think. So this was just a helpful reminder.
I think you have to find the gateway, the key for each child. And so I'll give you an example of teaching my children to read. My oldest child is my daughter, and she just loved reading from the get-go. She's a little baby. I would hold her on my lap. I'd show her those little baby books where you can squeeze something and it beeps, and then you can pet things. And, we went on. She would bring a stack of books every night to be read, and it was really a fun time. And I felt great. I thought, I'm strengthening these brain pathways for reading. She's going to be in great shape. And I made it a fun experience, and she really liked it. And then her brother was born, and I could hold him on my lap, and he would wiggle off in 2 seconds. And I tried getting books he really liked. He loved dinosaurs. We had 1 million dinosaur books, and he might stay 2 minutes instead of 30 seconds. But he did not want to read, and he wanted to crawl around. He wanted to play.
Yeah.
And then one night, my daughter asked if I would read this book to her that I was really tired of hearing. It was about a baby bird who falls out of a nest and asks every single other animal around, "Are you my mom?"
Yeah.
And I said,
I've read that book many times.
I'm tired of that book. I don't want to read it. And she goes, "Oh, Mom, I love that book." And I said, let's read something else. And she kind of is arguing with me. But then I noticed her brother. He now is crawling over, and he's old enough to walk, but he's on his hands and knees playing with something, I think blocks on the floor. And he says, you don't want to read that book? And I said, no, I don't like that book very much. He goes, well, I want to hear it. And he climbs up on the couch, and he wants to hear the book. And then he wants to hear it a second time. He just thinks it's hysterical that I'm reading a book that I don't like. And after that, he would try to find other books I don't like. Well, what things don't you like to read about?
Interesting.
And So I wised up. I started to have a lot of things I didn't like
in order
reading
to
about.
get him to do stuff.
And he would
That's
bring
great.
his own stack of books, and they would
Yeah.
be, and he just loved it. And I use it as an example of I would never advise parents to use that as a strategy to get their kids to
Sure.
read. But you have to figure out what is going to work for each individual child. So that requires the adult being really flexible. You know where you want to help the child go, but if they don't you want to get there using the tools to get them interested that usually work, then you have to be much more clever about how to get them interested. And different things work for different kids. So you just have to pay enormous attention to that individual child. What is going to engage them? How are you going to get them to learn social skills so they recognize people's emotions and can communicate with each other? How are you going to get them to be verbal and talk? How are you going to get them to read? And as a parent, you want them to do these things. And the children that get interested in doing them the normal way, that's not so hard.
Yeah.
But every child has things they don't want to do that you wish they would become good at. And it really, I think, is up to the adult to be more open-minded, more flexible, to
Absolutely.
work with the individual child.
Yeah, totally. Let me ask you a question on that because you mentioned the emotions. Your Narmite talk, I think you said the middle lower brain, the emotional brain, stops developing at 5 years. Is that right?
About 5 years of age. Right?
So if we I just have a question about that. So let's just fast forward into adulthood, and I work with and get questions a lot around, let's say an adult partner is with another partner who, and they're married, let's say, and one of them can't read the other one's emotions and isn't emotionally savvy at all. And in fact, it's like the bulk of their fights are about like, one of them's unwilling to like deal with her feelings, and she's like, no, my feelings are important, and you would just kind of tune into me, and like it's not that big a deal, just like validate my feelings. But he's like so emotionally jammed up, let's say, and I'm talking about my former self here. So in that case, could it be argued, like, would you say that that's probably an injury that happened between 1 and 5, that this kid didn't have the capacity, didn't build a lot of emotional skills, that those got kind of pruned away because I was focused on other things?
I think there's a high probability that you didn't use those emotional pathways enough. Now, there are millions of reasons for why that could be, but and certainly you're building the basic pathways that are going to recognize emotion in other people and then respond to them. And what you want to give children a chance to do is to see lots of different emotions, to name those emotions and explain them and show them back at children so that they learn that, like, if they make a happy face, they smile, that people are likely to smile back at them. If they look upset, that people are likely to show caring, that there is a give and take in emotion. So I always say with young children, you want to show lots of expressions of emotion. Parts of it are facial expressions, but parts of it are talking or being soothing or comforting or what your physical self is like. But you want to express emotion so the child learns to recognize emotions, and then you want to respond to that child when they make emotions. So they see the emotions have a give and take to them. If they make an emotion, people will respond to it, and they learn if you make an emotion, they should respond to it. So learning about emotions is really complicated. It's not an easy task. And that's
Took me
what they're
years.
doing in the first 5 years. And if they build the basic brain pathways for being able to do that well, they'll have them for the rest of their lives. Now, they may go on and have other emotions they didn't have in the first 5 years. And the example you gave of marriage partners not really tuning into each other. A young child under 5 isn't going to have experienced romantic love. And so it isn't that you haven't had that particular emotion. You just didn't build strong basic pathways that are used for expressing your own emotions or recognizing emotions, or recognizing that when people make emotions, you should make some emotion back at them, that it's a give and take.
Totally, and I'm a living example of it works. Like you can actually learn this into adulthood, so you don't need to just for the listener here, they don't need to like go, oh, I didn't learn that, so therefore I'm kind of screwed. We can learn that.
Yeah, you can learn it. So people ask me that question all the time. Well, you talk about plastic periods. You say the brain is developing pathways till about age 25. But what about age 50? What about age 90? I mean, does this mean you can't build new brain pathways? And the answer is you always can build new brain pathways. The bad news is takes much more work once you're past the plastic period.
Takes longer.
That's bad news. Yeah. So the brain is primed to build pathways what neuroscientists call plastic period. So we talked about the first 5 years being important. Plastic period for emotion recognition and regulation. We talked about that being the same for motor skills. We talked about higher reasoning being plastic until about 25. So during the plastic period, the brain is primed to make brain pathways. You use them, and it immediately makes a connection between brain cells, and it gets stronger. And yes, you might have to use them thousands of times to have a strong, permanent brain pathway. But once you do, you'll have that pathway for the rest of your life. So an example that people can often tune into is if you're a kid and you learn to ride a bicycle when you're 5, you may not ever get on a bicycle again from 7 or 8 until you're 30. But then you have kids and you think, oh, yeah, we should go bicycle riding. How do you do this? Chances are you get on that bicycle and very, very quickly you're going to know how to do it because you built brain pathways for that particular motor skill and balance skill. And they've been sitting there in your brain just waiting for you to get back on a bicycle. They haven't gone anywhere.
That's so cool.
So that is what learning during a plastic period is like. If you try building pathways outside of a plastic period, you have to use it many more times. So you thought 10,000 times was a lot. You're looking at 20, 50, 100,000 times to build pathways. And they'll never be as strong or as permanent as they would have been if you learned it in the plastic period. So yes, you can do it, but you have to be super motivated.
Yeah.
So you used it a lot.
I wonder if...
Good news, but you're going to have to work hard.
Right. Good news, bad news. Totally. I wonder, my own theory here, just throwing it out there in this moment, it seems like a lot of people stop learning around in their mid-20s. They stop sort of growing and they sort of start to get stuck in their life. And I wonder if this is part of the reason, is because learning becomes more difficult to feel confident in something.
That's exactly right. So learning does become more difficult. So you have to have a real motivation to do it, but it still can be done. It does, I think, as a society, what I really care about is that we recognize this and we really make use of those teenage and early 20s years to really still build skills. What worries me many times is that kids start to look adult in their mid-teens and we think, okay, our job is over. We don't have to be teaching them.
Right.
We don't have to be motivating them. They're on their own. They're adults. And if 15-year-olds should not be on their own, and they still need caring adults to encourage them to do things to build brain pathways for the next 10 years, because this is an incredibly important time. So I think it's a message that you'll be able to resonate with if you really, and especially if your kids are 9 and 11 now, you wait. As they get older, it really matters that you still care about them. You are going to have to find different ways of interacting with them. You can't tell them what to do. You have to try to encourage their interests in doing things. But that strong support from you is going to keep mattering, because if they make use of it and they're building skills in their teens and their early 20s, they're just going to do so much better in their whole rest of their adulthood than if you didn't do that.
Yeah, so cool. Thanks for that reminder. And I also, just to the parents out there, this is why I think it's so important that parents keep growing past 25. Like, you gotta, like, if we keep working on ourselves and developing ourselves and learning new things, that's really inspiring to kids versus just kind of sitting with a remote control and then telling your kids to do something. It's a very different kind of brain development situation.
Yeah.
Awesome. This has been great. As we're going to start winding down, I just wanted to get your quick take on left and right brain. My understanding is left brain, linear, logical. It's kind of the way I think of it. More conceptual. Right brain, more maybe emotional, relational, intuitive. Is that just a super simplistic reduction, but is that fair so far?
I'm not going to be a person that buys into that. I think if you have a neuroscientist, then that's
like,
so
dude,
simplistic, it's
so
just not
simple.
true.
How would you? Can you just give us a?
I usually don't go there with people. I say,
Great.
let's think about developing particular skills, and then thinking about how you can do that in a way that you really find engaging, so that you'll do it over and over again. I think your whole brain is involved in most things you do. So movement skills are controlled by a really specific area in the brain. We know exactly where the brain cells that initiate movement are. We've mapped them. We know where the movement cells for controlling your little finger are versus your cheek. We know that, but you have to use much more of your brain than just those cells. You have to want to make that movement. Well, that's a different part of your brain trying to direct the movement cells to get going. And then once you start the movement, you want to fine tune it. You don't want to make just a gross movement. You want to make a subtle movement that's exactly what you want. Then that's going to take a whole different part of your brain that modulates movement.
Yeah.
So when people talk about left brain, right brain, it's just so simplistic that it's hard to buy into that. You need to use multiple parts of your brain to do different things, and it comes from both sides. And so I usually just beg out of that conversation.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's great. And is it, what do you think about Paul MacLean's sort of triune brain? Is that still a fair model, or is that a little outdated these days? Because it just seems so straightforward in terms of the three brains. If people think of it in a three brain, if we look at the architecture of the brain.
Right. Again, I tend to not go there.
Okay.
I think neuroscience knows a huge amount nowadays for where is each function being carried out and when is it developing. But we also know that the integration between brain areas is really important to kind of have a finished ability to do something.
Yeah.
I mean, anything you can think of, talking, reading, We know what circuits you're using to talk. We know what circuits you're using to read. But you had to want to do the reading.
Mm-hmm.
Then you had to think about what the reading you read meant to you. If we want you to read something and then do something, to take an initiative because you read something, that's a whole other parts of the brain. So we know enough nowadays that I think it's a shame not to teach people the complexity, because we want to raise children that can function really well in the real world. They have to be able to do complex things. And so I think we don't do ourselves any favors by simplifying it more. We have to get people to think about, what do you want your child to have the ability to do? Think of a way to get them engaged in doing it. Give them lots of praise, lots of positive feedback, so they'll do it again and again. And then they'll use the multiple parts of their brain to do that. They'll strengthen them and they'll get better at it.
Oh, great. Okay, two more questions here. What's for the adults listening, as we age, what's one thing we can do to strengthen our brain?
I mean, I think you should keep pushing yourself to learn new things, because it isn't that you don't make brain circuits. You keep being able to do that. You just have to be, I always say, be lenient on yourself. If it's going to take you twice as long to learn something, well, okay, it's going to take you twice as long to learn something, but you can learn it. And if you keep doing that, your brain is going to essentially stay very engaged and building and growing and problem solving. If we want to work against kind of the neural decline that happens as you age, I mean, there's a big increase in age-related problems with neurodegeneration and not using your brain. There's really good data that shows that the more you're learning and the more you're actively thinking in adulthood, the less likely you are to have neural decline as you get older. So you want to keep pushing yourself to adapt to new things, learn new things. I myself do quite a bit of research on the effects of exercise on the brain, and exercise is very neuroprotective. And so I'm always pushing people to exercise. Maybe they don't want to put on jogging shorts and go out and exercise. I say, park your car as far away from the grocery store as possible and walk every aisle of the grocery store. You're exercising.
Yeah.
You're just doing it in your own way.
Totally.
But be active. It's really good for your brain.
Yeah, I love the line, the more you're learning, the less likely you are to have a neural decline as you age. So boom, I think that says it all there. Okay, last question Judy, I ask all my guests this, and it's going to be interesting with you because I'd love to hear what you have to say from a neuroscience perspective. If I had a room of 1,000 high school students and I could only teach them one thing about love or relationships, what would you want? And you were whispering in my ear, what would you want me to tell them?
I would probably try to challenge them and say, you want to show you care to somebody standing next to you. Think of a way that really reflects yourself to show that. Because I think there's not a right way or a wrong way. And what I always am trying to get across to people is you have your own individual ways of doing these things. And that's a good thing. You've developed strong brain pathways for who you are. And so I think when you challenge people to be creative and to tune into themselves and what is different about me, how could I really show I love or I care? about the person standing next to me, then they're trying to really think about who they are and how to reflect themselves. And I think you would get, if you had 1,000 kids, you get 1,000 different ways of doing this. And then you, as the commentator, needs to be able to reflect that back to them so that they see that there isn't a right way and a wrong way to do this, that they should embrace the diversity of how people do this.
Awesome. Yeah, that's cool. Just taking some notes again. I took a lot of notes on this one. Thank you. Where can people, Judy, find out more about you, the work you're doing with children, families?
Yeah, so we have an educational program that we make available to people, and we make educational materials to teach people, for people to teach others about brain development. And that is at our website, www.workingforkids, all one word, workingforkids.com. I can be reached very easily by going to that website. I'm available at Judy Cameron at workingforkids.com.
Okay, awesome. We'll put that in the show notes. Cool. Thanks, Judy. It's been such a pleasure to see you again and to just pick your brain, as they say.
Well, it was very fun to talk to you. So this was great.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for your time and all the best. Your action step today is to go check out Judy Cameron, her work. If you want to watch some YouTube videos, there's a couple that are nice, sort of intro stuff. If you resonate with this at all. Okay, there's a lot of helpful stuff in there. I thought the 3 things to build a strong brain were really interesting. So, got your kid or you have to be interested. You got to be engaged, and that builds self-confidence over time. That was cool. But I want to underscore this point, okay? I notice how a lot of adults fall asleep, seriously, in their 20s, and they stay asleep the rest of their lives. They stop learning. And this was very validating for me to hear that at age 25, people the learning gets harder, really, to remember things and to build those new pathways and to make them fire quickly. And it sounded like it takes twice as long to learn something after age 25. But guys, is that a good enough reason to not engage in things that interest you? That's why the 9-month training, we have 9 months to practice together, because I know it's hard, it's intense. We hold you accountable through homework. So hopefully you'll join us someday. It's extremely valuable to be in a container where you're held accountable, because left to our own devices, right, we start and stop a lot of things. You might have noticed that. And then we fall back to our familiar thing, which often is like staying stuck. Yeah. Okay. Again, really appreciating you guys for your listening ears, for the reviews, for your engagement, your participation. Remember to try to track me down on the East Coast in late April or in late May in Boulder for our Accepted and Connected weekend, relationshipschool.com/connected. In the meantime, you can join our free group, relationshipschool.com/community. Okay, we'll see y'all soon. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Relationship School fans and Smart Couple listeners, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, all right? Do us a favor, subscribe, share one of these videos with a friend, all right? We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships, and you are one of them, so thank you.